Well, welcome back. We are still plowing through the book of Daniel. We are nearing the end. We did chapter 10 last week. We kind of dipped into chapter 11 a little bit. We're going to do chapter 11 this week and dip into chapter 12. And next week, we will finish out the book of Daniel. Amazing, amazing journey that we've taken in this book so far. So from our study last week, we found Daniel receiving a very long, detailed prophecy concerning the final kings of Persia and most notably of the Greek Empire. And the prophecies covered multiple generations of leaders in both kingdoms. And in fact, when we include the earlier prophecies that Daniel received, we find a relatively complete overview of the first three kingdoms of the age of the Gentiles. I've still got my sinus and allergies going on, so you're going to have to excuse me if I keep drinking. So we know how the age starts. It starts with Nebuchadnezzar. We know how it moves through a total of 4 Gentile empires. And each of these 4 kingdoms takes its turn at oppressing God's people in Israel until such time as the Lord is ready to set up his kingdom and free Israel from Gentile oppression. And so last week, we learned briefly about 4 of the Persian kings. But quickly, the angel Gabriel moved into an in-depth look at 2 kingdoms coming out of the Alexandrian Empire. And Daniel received incredibly precise and detailed prophecy about the North Kingdom and the South Kingdom. And we saw how the North was the Seleucid Empire and the South was the Ptolemaic Empire. Now, these prophecies concerning these kingdoms ran from verse 5 through 20 and covered a span of several hundred years. During that time, the North and the South warred almost continually. And their battlefield, for the most part, was in Israel, because remember, the border between the 2 kingdoms went right through the middle of Israel. So their conflicts served to accomplish the trampling of Jerusalem that God intended. Now, while the history of the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms was interesting, its principal value to us is threefold. Number one, the incredible accuracy of these predictions gives us complete assurance that Daniel received this knowledge from God. It means that we can take the rest of his prophecy with the same assurance. Much of what Daniel recorded still hasn't happened yet. So we have to look to what he wrote with as much certainty concerning the future as we do the past. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we see how the Lord controls these kings and kingdoms like pieces on a chessboard to accomplish his plan for Israel. Remember, the Lord numbered the kingdoms in the age of the Gentiles, but more than that, he also explains why they have to do as they do, because they are moving according to a plan, to his plan. So in other words, the rise and the fall of these kingdoms and these empires isn't just happenstance. It's according to God's plan. It's according to his wishes, his desires. In a similar fashion, the age will end on a specific day that God has already determined by the return of his son. So both the degree of detail found in these prophecies and the course of every event fit into God's plan and demonstrate the reach of God's sovereignty. We simply can't read a chapter like Daniel 11 without acknowledging the fact that all history lies in God's control. He's not a dispassionate observer of human behavior. He didn't press the button and then, sat back and say, hey, let's see what happens. He is in control, and he is leading the world to the place he desires that it will go. So we ended in verse 20 last week. We had reached the point where the Seleucid Empire's king had been poisoned by a disloyal Jewish tax collector. As Antiochus III dies, his son Antiochus IV rises to power. Now, Antiochus IV becomes a focal point in Gabriel's message. to Daniel and the subject of Daniel's prophecy from verse 21 to 35. Now, you might remember this man from our study of chapter 8. In chapter 8, Daniel saw a vision somewhat similar to the vision he saw in chapter 7 of an animal with horns. In chapter 8, he saw a goat with 4 horns, followed by a small horn that grew stronger than the rest. And that small horn invades the beautiful land Israel. That small horn was Antiochus IV. Now, he was called a small horn because he serves as a type for another terrible leader of the future. And that future leader will be the antichrist, who himself was represented by another small horn in chapter 7. So we have 2 rulers, one near term to Daniel, Antiochus IV, and one far term, the Antichrist. Now, both are symbolized in chapters of Daniel as little horns. The earlier one is a type of the later one. So now in chapter 11, we find yet another prophecy about Antiochus and the Antichrist. And once again, Antiochus will serve as a type or a forerunner or a shadow of the Antichrist. And remember, types in Scripture are always lesser to their greater fulfillment. The type is the lesser, the fulfillment is the greater. So that is to say that Antiochus IV will say and do things that are similar to the things the Antichrist will eventually say and do. But the magnitude and the effect of the work of the Antichrist will be far greater than that of Antiochus IV. They're going to do similar things, but the things that the Antichrist do are going to have more far-reaching impact. So let's look at what we learn about Antiochus IV. Daniel chapter 11, verse 21. In his place, a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. He will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table. But it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. So this passage begins with in his place. It's talking about the murdered king, Seleucus IV Philopator. In his place comes a man who is a truly evil person. Gabriel says he will be despicable. It means someone who is despised. Now, who's he going to be despised by? He's going to be despised by the Jewish people for his cruelty. In fact, it's very likely that this man shares another key quality with the coming Antichrist. He was almost certainly indwelled by a demon, and perhaps by Satan himself, for reasons I'll explain later. Now, Antiochus IV was not the rightful heir of Seleucus IV Philopator. He was able to seize control of the throne because Seleucus IV Philopator's oldest son was being held captive in Rome. So after convincing the leaders of Syria to allow him to rule in place of the captive son, Antiochus IV quickly consolidated power. And in verse 21, we see his illegitimate rise to power described. He was a ruthless man. As we learned in chapter 8, Antiochus IV declared that he was a god in the form of man. He took the name Antiochus Epiphanes, which means a manifestation of God. But he was prone to unpredictable and strange behavior. This led his subjects to call him Antiochus Epimanes, which means madman. Further evidence that he was likely demon-possessed. Now, the statements in verses 22 and 23 are an overview of the passage that follows. We're told this king will push aside an overflowing force. He will also depose a prince of a covenant, and he will gain power over his adversary with a minimum of forces because he relies on deception. It begins in verse 24 as Antiochus collects riches from among the vassals of his kingdom. He doesn't use these riches for himself. Instead, he uses them to buy allegiances in preparation for war against the Ptolemaic kingdom. So doing this, he will achieve a victory that his fathers never achieved, namely invading the heart of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Now, his campaign against Egypt began in 170 BC when he marched a large army southward into the Nile Delta without detection. Ptolemy VI responded by sending a much larger army to oppose Antiochus. But verse 23 tells us that Antiochus was able to defeat Ptolemy VI's forces with his smaller force, and he managed to capture the Egyptian city of Memphis, not Tennessee, where Graceland is, but Memphis, Egypt. So, as verse 25 tells us, Antiochus succeeded in part through deception. The deception came in two ways. In verses 26 and 27, it described. In verse 26, we learn that two of the king's counselors who shared his table deceived him. These two counselors wanted to undermine the young king and replace him. So they convinced Ptolemy VI to make bad military decisions, leading to his defeat and the loss of many lives. The second deception came when Ptolemy VI and Antiochus IV sat down to negotiate a peace in verse 27. Now, Antiochus had Memphis, but he couldn't capture the key Egyptian city of Alexandria. So Antiochus told Ptolemy VI that if he surrendered Alexandria, then Antiochus would allow Ptolemy to continue ruling. Meanwhile, Ptolemy agreed to let Antiochus have the city and vowed loyalty to Antiochus, but he was lying too. They were all lies, all lies. In verse 27, it says Antiochus IV kept Ptolemy prisoner under guard while he attacked the city. And despite Ptolemy's assurances, the city of Alexandria did not surrender. So when Antiochus tried to take the city, the inhabitants fought back and named Ptolemy VI's younger brother king instead. Now, Antiochus eventually left for home. He decided to let the battles for Egypt wait for another day. Finally, in verse 28, then, we're told Antiochus IV returns to Syria with much plunder taken from Memphis. Along the way, he passes through Israel again, as he must. While he's in town, a Jew named Jason decided to take opportunity for his ambition. Jason wanted to be made high priest of Israel. So he bribed Antiochus IV to install him in place of the real high priest, who was named Onias III. Seeing Jason's success, a third man, Menelaus, also bribed Antiochus IV to be made high priest. Antiochus was always one for personal gain, so he agreed to install Menelaus over Jason. Later on, Onias, the true high priest, protests against these moves, and the Jews begin to align their support behind one of these men. Some went for Jason, some went for Menelaus, some went for Onias. Eventually, Antiochus, now back in Syria, is tired of all this political maneuvering within Israel. So he has Onias, the high priest, killed along with those who schemed with these other two men. So then he decides to pursue a vendetta against the Jewish people in the city of Jerusalem. So in 168 BC, his army enters the city of Jerusalem, kills 80,000 Jews, and desecrates the temple. Now, before we move into the rest of Antiochus IV's story, we can already see some parallels to the coming Antichrist. Back in 8 and 9, we learned that the Antichrist will rise to power over a period of time. He's initially going to come to power among 10 other world rulers. And during those early years, he gains power through intrigue and military victories, leading 3 kings to conspire against him. Now, eventually, he dies as a result of their treachery, but he comes back to life again with greater power to deceive the world. After gaining power at the middle of the tribulation, he turns his attention to persecuting the Jewish people, especially in Jerusalem. So this arc, this story arc, is foreshadowed in the events of Antiochus's life. He acts in similar ways, although on a smaller scale, in keeping with being a forerunner, but his similarities to the Antichrist only grow. Look at verse 29. At the appointed time, he will return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore, he will be disheartened, and he will return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. Now, back in verse 27, Gabriel told Daniel that this king wouldn't prevail against his enemy in the south until the appointed time. Now, verse 29 says that time has come. In the same year that Antiochus rampaged Jerusalem, he also decided to continue southward to attack Egypt again. Upon his arrival, he discovers the Roman consul Populus Laenus had sailed from Cyprus to secure the territory for Rome. And in verse 30, we're told that ships from Kittim will bring this army to Egypt. Now, Cyprus is the modern name for Kittim. So faced with a superior army, Antiochus IV has no choice but to return home. He was prevented from entering Egypt as he had hoped, just like verse 29 says. His return trip took him once again through, you guessed it, Israel. As verse 30 explains, he's enraged by his loss to Rome. So he decides to take the loss out against the Jewish people. Now, that reference to the Holy Covenant, that's always a reference to the Old Covenant by which the Jews received the law and the temple service. Opposing this covenant meant opposing the practice of the law and the temple service. Similarly, Antiochus IV showed favor for any Jew who would likewise oppose practice of the Mosaic law. So to stop the Jews from practicing the law, the king used deception to gain entry into the city with his force of 22,000 men. Once inside the city walls, he attacked the Jews on a Sabbath when they were reluctant to fight back. His general, Apollonius, I guess, killed many in the city and took many Jews captives as slaves. He plundered the temple of its gold, and he set the city on fire. Antiochus set his mind on exterminating the Jewish people and ending Jewish religious practice forever. So, in addition to the destruction done by his general, Antiochus banned the Mosaic law, including temple services and the feasts. He burned all copies of the law that he could find. He set up a statue of Zeus, which was his god, inside the temple, along with an altar where he made burnt offerings. And just for good measure, he sacrificed a pig on the Jewish altar and demanded that Jews continue to sacrifice swine there and on Antiochus the fourth's birthday. Now, pig blood in the temple prevented the Jews from using the temple until such time that it had been properly cleansed. Again, going back to chapter 8, this event was so ignominious that it was given a name, the abomination of desolation. It's also mentioned here in verse 31. The abomination refers to all the steps Antiochus took to desecrate the temple in December of 168 BC. Now, right here, we find a very specific parallel to the Antichrist of tribulation. In Matthew 24, Jesus warned, verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever's on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Jesus spoke these words after Antiochus IV lived and died. Since Jesus was speaking about a future time, clearly, he was talking about a different event. But Jesus specifically referred back to Daniel 9, where the Antichrist is described. So we're seeing in Jesus' words confirmation that the account of Antiochus is a picture or a type of something much greater yet to come. In fact, Jesus adds the words, let the reader understand, to emphasize that a deeper understanding is required. That deeper understanding is knowing that Antiochus IV pictures the Antichrist. Let me say that again. Antiochus IV pictures the Antichrist. Based on prior chapters of Daniel, along with chapter 11, we see that picture coming together. Now, in Daniel 9, we learned that the Antichrist will make a covenant with the people of Israel to allow them to restart sacrifices in their temple. But at the midpoint of tribulation, the Antichrist will stop the sacrifice and the grain offering. Then he will set up another abomination of desolation in the temple. Revelation 13 gives us a hint of what that future abomination will be. Revelation 13, verse 14. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the signs which it was given him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who had the wound of the sword and has come to life. And it was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause as many as do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. The Antichrist will be supported by a false prophet who will deceive the world into worshiping the Antichrist as God. To facilitate the world's worship, the false prophet will set up an image of the Antichrist in the temple. This image will have the supernatural power to speak, which only inspires the world's awe and devotion all the more. Clearly, Antiochus IV pictures these events. He entered Jerusalem. He put an end to the law so that he can supplant worship of Yahweh with his own system. And Antiochus IV set up an image in the temple, just as Jesus forewarned would be the calling card of the future Antichrist as well. The parallels continue. Daniel chapter 11, verse 32. By smooth words, he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now, when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Antiochus convinced many faithless Jews to participate in Zeus worship. He was an expert at pitting various Jewish factions against one another in order to gain what he wanted. He first gained the defection of the progressive elements of Israel, who were already apostate, and they were quick to obey his demands. Once he had their loyalty, Antiochus IV turned to the conservative elements in Jewish society. He offered to help them root out the progressive elements within Israel if they pledged their loyalty to him. Well, the conservative Jews were so threatened by the progressives that they agreed to these terms. So they adopted the view that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So in the end, Antiochus was able to take both groups into idolatry through his adept manipulation. Now, because of these atrocities, a Jewish revolt broke out in verse 32. A priest named Mattathias and his sons rose up in Ephraim and led an army of conservative Jews against Antiochus IV. And eventually the movement pushed the Seleucids out of Israel altogether. In the battle, Antiochus IV's general Apollonius was killed. Now, interestingly, the Maccabean revolt didn't please every Jew in Israel. The apostate progressives feared the rise of the conservatives within Judaism. So they didn't favor the revolt, and they didn't fight against Antiochus. But meanwhile, Antiochus retaliated by killing many of those who had opposed him by both sword and burning. Now, even though he inflicted great losses upon Israel, he wasn't able to retake the land. And within a few years, Antiochus IV died insane in Persia, probably the result of a lifetime of being indwelled by demons. Eventually, the success of the Maccabees won over all of Israel, and the progressives eventually united with the conservatives. And after their victory, the Maccabees founded a new conservative Jewish kingdom. In fact, the Jewish culture kind of swung hard to the right. The Mosaic law returned with far greater zealousness, which is described in verse 33. Those who knew God's law began to spread its practice and understanding among the largely apostate Jewish population. Some of those leading this revivalist movement later became the Pharisees of Jesus' day. Others became the Essenes, who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. And many of those who were opposed to the revolt in the beginning later joined in support of the Maccabees, which is the hypocrisy that's mentioned in verse 34. Now, a lot of people in Israel died during these battles, but it served a godly purpose. Notice in verse 35, we're told that those who have insight will fall. These are the godly ones, the ones that love the Lord, the ones that love his law. Why does the Lord allow some who are his to die in this way? Well, Gabriel says it has to happen in order to refine and purge and purify the rest until the end. The rest refers to the rest of Israel. So the death of some of the faithful was intended to push out apostasy in Israel. And it did cause the apostate within Israel to come into line with the conservatives. And this purge was so powerful that it kept Israel orthodox until the end times. Over the millennia, the people of Israel have remained largely true to their law in every generation since that time. there have always been apostate Jews, even until today. But for the most part, Jewishness was forever associated with observing the law. And Judaism has never since reverted to the widespread apostasy of past ages. So here again, we see a type for the last days with the Antichrist. In the last days, the Jewish people return to a state similar to the time before Antiochus. The Jewish people will have largely become apostate. Apart from a small Orthodox minority, most Jews today don't practice the law in any meaningful way. And of course, they can't do the temple service today because there's no temple. But because of the rise of the Antichrist, great war will break out. And in the midst of that conflict, there will be martyrs. And as we read in Revelation, speaking of how Satan attacks God's people in the time of tribulation, Revelation 12:17. So the dragon was enraged with the woman. The dragon is Satan. The woman is Christ, or the mother of Christ, and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And then the result of this turmoil is seen in Revelation 6. Revelation 6:9, when the Lamb broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they had maintained. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And there was given to each of them a white robe, and they were told that they should rest for a little while longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who were to be killed, even as they had been, would be completed also. These martyrs served God's greater goal of purifying Israel during the tribulation. Zechariah 13:8 says, It will come about in all the land, declares the Lord, that two parts in it will be cut off and perish, but the third will be left in it. And I will bring the third part through the fire, refine them as silver is refined, and test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name, and I will answer them, and I will say, These are my people, and they will say, The Lord is my God. So the tribulation will lead some of Israel to be cut off, but others will be refined and call upon the Lord. Also, in preparation for this time of purging, the Lord will promote the rise of conservative Orthodox Judaism in Israel. In the last days, God will supernaturally provoke Jewish desire to follow the law according to the promises given in Malachi. Malachi chapter 4, verse 4. Remember the law of Moses, my servant, even the statutes and ordinances which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I am going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, so that I will not come and smite the land with a curse. To bring Israel back to an observance of her law, the Lord will bring an appearance of Elijah the prophet. And as Malachi explains, Elijah will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children. That means giving the modern descendants of Israel the same heart for God's law that their ancestors had. And conversely, the hearts of the children will return to where their fathers' hearts were. This is a description of Israel returning from apostasy immediately before the great and terrible day of the Lord. That's the tribulation. This is the end time that Gabriel mentions in Daniel in verse 35. The nation of Israel was brought back into a degree of orthodoxy by the actions of Antiochus IV. It required the intense evil of such a man to unite the people of Israel in following their law. That good work resulted in loss of life, even among the godly, but it also rescued Israel from apostasy for a time. And then in the last days, a new revival will be needed. So another terribly despicable man will be required. The Lord will permit the rise of the Antichrist so he can use this one to bring Israel back into the bond of the covenant. We read that in Daniel chapter 9 earlier. Now in Daniel chapter 11, we transition to the far term prophecy concerning the one that Antiochus is a picture of, who is the Antichrist. Verse 36, then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. And he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. But instead, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold and silver and costly stones and treasures. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign God. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him and will cause them to rule over the many and will parcel out land for a price. Now, at first, this passage sounds like we're still talking about Antiochus. And in fact, the story, the narrative is so subtle that it's easy to miss the break. But one clue that we've moved to events of the last days is found in the final mention of an appointed time in verse 35. That reference is a clue that we have now jumped ahead in time, starting in verse 36. And the context of the passage makes it clear that we're talking about someone else. The events of this passage have no parallel in history, so they must still be future. That's our second clue that we have transitioned to the one that Antiochus IV pictures, which is the Antichrist. We are looking into the final of the 77s from Daniel 9. Now, this future king will do as he pleases in a future day, meaning no one will challenge his power. In particular, he will magnify himself above every god everywhere. Now, we know that Antiochus called himself a manifestation of God, but he still acknowledged the other gods as well. In particular, we noted earlier, he worshiped and sacrificed to Zeus. And we know that Antiochus couldn't do everything he pleased, especially where Rome was concerned. But this king will declare there is no other God above himself. And in the process, he will speak monstrous things against the true God. As he does these things, he will prosper, but only until the indignation is finished. Now, the indignation refers to the state of suffering for Israel during this time. This period of judgment for Israel has been decreed. It must be accomplished. Then in verse 37, I'm so sorry. In verse 37, we find that this man will have no regard for any god worshiped by his fathers, which means his predecessors, his ancestors. So he won't have a religious past. He won't be an avowed follower of any religion himself. Instead, he's going to assume the role of icon. This is the moment at the middle of the tribulation we discussed earlier, when the Antichrist is resurrected by the power of Satan. From that point forward, he declared himself to be God, and the world will believe it based on his miraculous resurrection. He will also have no desire for women. Now, this line has intrigued a lot of Bible students and led to some very unhelpful speculation. It simply means this man will show no interest in normal human sexual relationships. It has nothing to do with his sexual preference. It's just it's essential to his claims to being a Messiah. God doesn't need sex. Jesus had no interest in women. So the Antichrist counterfeits this quality of the Messiah. He foregoes romantic interests to project himself as a Messiah. Then in verse 38, Gabriel says this man will honor a God of fortresses, a God his fathers didn't know. Now, I think this God is the same one called a foreign God in verse 39. This God is honored by the Antichrist's reign and rule. And even as the Antichrist calls himself God, He likewise reflects glory upon a strange God who wasn't worshipped in the same way before. It sounds similar to the relationship between Jesus and the Father. Jesus Christ is the name above all names. He is God, yet he also honors God the Father. So here again, the Antichrist is continuing to counterfeit Christ. Now, we learned earlier that the Antichrist will be resurrected at the midpoint of the tribulation by the power of Satan, Revelation 13:2. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. They worshiped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him?" The beast here is the Antichrist. The dragon is Satan. Notice that Satan gives his power to the Antichrist. And then after the Antichrist is resurrected, the Antichrist causes the world to worship both the dragon and himself. Again, we see a counterfeit trinity emerging in the time of the tribulation. The Antichrist wants to be a Messiah. Satan is his foreign god who is worshiped because of the false Messiah. The only person missing is the Holy Spirit, and the false prophet and his freakish speaking image serves that purpose. So then in verse 39, we're told that this king will show honor to those who honor him. He's going to parcel out land for a price. He's going to control commerce. He's going to control the ability to produce food. Revelation confirms this behavior in the Antichrist in Revelation 13:15. And it was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause as many as who do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. And he causes all, the small and the great, and the rich and the poor, and the free men and the slaves, to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. And he provides that no one will be able to buy or sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. So the Antichrist is going to control commerce with a mark that he assigns to all humanity. Only those who take the mark can buy and sell, the parceling out of land for a price. And those who fail to take the mark are beheaded, according to Revelation 20. Finally, Gabriel describes how this man comes to his end. Verse 40, Daniel chapter 11, at the end time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships. And he will enter countries and overflow them and pass through. He will also enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hand: Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. Then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape, but he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. But rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. So similar to Antiochus IV, the Antichrist will fight neighbors. But notice, however, this king is fighting both south and north, which means, again, this can't be Antiochus IV because he didn't fight himself. So the most likely explanation is that these powers are the three horns that the Antichrist uproots after his resurrection. These kings tried to kill the Antichrist at the midpoint of tribulation. So after he's resurrected, the Antichrist seeks revenge by attacking these kings. According to Gabriel, the Antichrist will succeed in moving through these nations and subduing all of them, just as we learned in Daniel 7. And also, like Antiochus IV, the Antichrist will make a special point of invading Israel, the beautiful land. Just as Antiochus tried to destroy the Jewish people, so will the Antichrist place special emphasis on eliminating Israel. The enemy's focus on destroying Israel is directly related to Israel's role in Christ's second coming. As Daniel's prophecies have taught us, The Messiah returns to put an end to Gentile rule and set up a Jewish kingdom. But what if there are no Jews left? What if the enemy has succeeded in wiping out the Jewish nation? Then Jesus' second coming would be thwarted. So Satan thinks. So therefore, Satan has always made it his goal to remove the Jewish people from the earth. And he's been working through various means over the millennia to end the Jewish people. And once Satan is indwelling the Antichrist, he will turn his full attention to that goal. But in verses 41 and 42, we also learn that his conquests will fell many surrounding nations. But all the nations we hear are neighbors to Israel. Why don't we hear of other areas on the earth? Well, because by this time in the tribulation, very little of the earth is going to be still inhabited. The judgments of tribulation have destroyed most of the earth, leaving only the area we call the Middle East. And within this small space, the Antichrist operates, and he defeats his enemies in all directions, except for a few key areas. These areas are all east of Israel, and they're spared by God for the purpose of preserving a remnant of Israel. Edom, Moab, and Ammon all refer to land east of the Jordan. And in this area, the Lord will preserve a portion of Israel in protection in the desert. Calling Israel a woman and the Antichrist indwelled by Satan a dragon, Revelation describes this defense of these territories. Revelation 12:13, when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. Notice Israel is held in safety in the desert for 3.5 years. That's the length of the second half of the tribulation. They are held in a place called the sheep's pen, or Batsra. Micah 2, verse 12. I will surely assemble all of you, Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together like sheep in the fold, in the sheep pen. Like a flock in the midst of its pasture, they will be noisy with men. This place is in present-day Jordan. So the Lord will spare these places from the Antichrist to protect the remnant of Israel. Now, finally, like Antiochus IV, the Antichrist will plunder many, yet in the end, he will be defeated in battle. In verse 44, we're told that the Antichrist will be drawn into battle with rumors from the east and the north. These rumors draw him and his allies into battle against Jerusalem and the last fortress of Jews in the city. But unlike the Jews held in safety in Batsra, these Jews are unbelieving, yet they're Orthodox. It's these last remaining Jews who must call out for the Lord to bring about his return. So to prevent that outcome, the Antichrist camps his army west of Jerusalem between the Holy Mountain and the Great Sea. He's going to attack the city on the western side. There, he meets his end as a result of Christ's second coming. Christ comes through the east gate of the city and leads the population out of the city to safety, and then he fights the Antichrist and destroys him. Now, we don't have time today to walk you through the entire battle that takes place at this point. The Revelation Bible study would fill in those gaps. But for now, it's enough to know that Gabriel foretells the end of the Antichrist in the battle for Jerusalem. And as we already know, the Antichrist's death is the last act of the age of the Gentiles. So that concludes chapter 11. We are going to jump into chapter 12 next week. Again, that's going to be the last chapter. I want to remind you to hit that subscribe button if you want to keep seeing these videos. There may be a couple of weeks in between the end of the book of Daniel and the next study, because I'm preparing that next study, and real life kind of jumps in and gets in the way of, the important plans. So I'm a little behind on getting that study ready and everything, but hit that subscribe button so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. We will have a video next week, God willing, and then there may be a couple of weeks in between where there may be a lull, but I haven't stopped the channel. I'm still going to do teacher talk, and I'm still going to do Bible studies. I've got several sources for these Bible studies, and they're being used. They have no copyright on them, so I'm able to share them with you guys. And I hope it's a help. They're helpful to me as I study them, as I prepare them, and I hope they're helpful to you. My goal in doing this is to help people get a better understanding of the Bible. A lot of people read the Bible and they go, okay, well, that's interesting, and they understand bits and pieces of it, but they don't get the deeper meanings and the deeper implications and the relationships between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and how those two parts of the Bible are linked. And that's the burden that God has placed on my heart, to show people that the Bible is one cohesive book. The Old Testament points to the New Testament. The Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. The New Testament is a fulfillment of everything in the Old Testament. So that's my goal. That's my burden that God's put on my heart. And I hope I am doing that for those of you who are watching. And stay safe, stay well, stay in the Word, and we will see you next time on Teacher Talk. God bless.